This lets people in recording, then I'm going to connect to Facebook. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. We will get started in just a little bit.
You were getting a good number of participants, almost up to 30.
Yeah, that's great. Looks like we had some additional people.
Screen changed a little bit. Wing, are we still on? Oops. I can't hear you, Wing. Are you muted?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I do not know what happened there. They kicked me out and I couldn't get back in.
Everybody else stayed with us, so we still have 43 people. So
you know, it's funny, I could see it on Facebook and I just assumed that everything was still going okay. It's like, well, if anything, he can just run the show. Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it just another minute to let folks join us. Really extraordinary.
Yeah, the numbers are still going up a little bit.
Yeah. I see some folks on Facebook as well. Good morning. We are streaming live on Facebook. Thanks for joining us, and we'll get started in just a little bit. All right, everyone. Looks like we have a pretty full house. So I think I will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Wayne Grabowski. I work for the City of Portland, which coordinates the Fix Affairs. The Fix Affairs are normally in-person community resource events, but since the pandemic, we've been hosting workshops online that would be some of the same content that you would see at the in-person events. And this is our second season of the fairs. It's been pretty exciting. And I'm very excited to welcome back Dennis from the Master Gardener Program. Dennis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you for inviting me back to the Fix It Fair. It's good to be here again. I'm going to share my screen and let me know if there are any technical issues with this as we proceed. All right. Welcome to Growing a Bounty of Berries. Today I'm going to provide you with some information on how to grow caneberries, that is raspberries and blackberries, as well as blueberries and strawberries in your home garden. So if you were expecting something else, you might want to try to find that talk you were looking for. If that's what you expected, you're in the right place.
It was something I wanted to catch you before you introduced Ron, but it's not a problem. I just at the last minute thought about it.
I'm hearing
But in the
I'm hearing someone else on the screen, so if you could mute,
language instead,
that would be greatly appreciated. If
a community sign.
And it looked like we had some folks join us as panelists, and they were unmuted, so I muted them. So I think we're ready to go now. Sorry about that, and thank you.
can you hear me now?
I can now. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is Growing a Bounty of Berries, which is a talk about growing raspberries and blackberries in your home garden, as well as blueberries and strawberries. My name is Dennis Brown. I'm an Oregon State University Master Gardener volunteer. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and I've been gardening my whole life. I garden now in Northeast Portland. I have a home garden at my home, and then I also have a small community garden plot as well, where I grow vegetables and all the fruits that I'm talking about today for my home use. I also have degrees in horticulture and in plant biology, but I'm mostly really happy now today to talk to you about growing your produce in your home garden. As an Oregon State Master Gardener volunteer, I'm part of the program which educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. Master gardeners are volunteer educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers. We serve the community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a love of lifelong learning. If you'd like to know more about the Master Gardener program, you can ask me about that. At the end of this talk, we'll have a question and answer period, or if you have any questions that come up during the talk, you can ask them at the end of the program, and we will try to answer them, or I'll point you in the direction of places you can go to find those answers. Before we start, I'd also like to do a land acknowledgement. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their home along the Columbia River. People from these lands are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, many of whom maintain a connection to their ancestral homelands and continue their traditional cultural practices. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge the original caretakers of the land, and I encourage you to learn more about the history of the land that you live on and where you grow your food. And on this graphic that I presented, you can see there's a source that says native-lands.ca. That's a great source to find more information about the tribal histories and the histories of the people that preceded us on this land where we now live and call home. With that, I'd like to start my talk on why plant small fruits and berries. Well, I think the photo on the left says it all. Having really delicious, ripe fruit during the growing season is one reason, very important reason, to grow fruits and berries in your yard. And they're really well adapted to the soil and climate of the Willamette Valley. Strawberries, blueberries, raspberries do really well here. We have great soil and great climate for that. And a thoughtful selection of crops and cultivars of these fruits will ensure that you can have produce throughout the growing season, starting, say, from late May or middle of May, all the way through October, depending on the year and how cold and rainy it gets in the fall. So they're really great for just having a sustained production of fruit throughout the summer. They're also the right size plants for home gardens. They're bushes, and of course, strawberries are just small plants that grow in your garden. They're not big trees that you have to maintain, so they're just the right size, easy to pick from the ground, easy to manage. Plants also provide great nutritional and aesthetic value. You can see these lovely raspberries. They have great antioxidants and other good compounds in them that are good for your health. And they're also, especially like the blueberries, will have lovely red foliage in the fall, so they add to that fall color in your yard. So they're a great choice for our yards and home gardens here in the Pacific Northwest. Another great reason for growing those 4 crops in particular, strawberries, blueberry, raspberries, and blackberries that I'm going to talk about today, is they're relatively easy to grow. They have fewer pest problems and are better adapted to our pretty wet climate here in the northern Willamette Valley. This is a table that was made by Monica Maggio of Core Home Fruit, and she sort of ranked the plants from easiest to most difficult, and you can see that the ones I'm talking about today are among the easiest plants to grow in your home garden. So these plants are a great choice for those of you who live in the northern Willamette Valley. So today I'm going to talk on various topics about small fruit. I'm going to start with site selection and the characteristics of a good site to grow these plants. I'm going to talk a little bit about watering, soil and fertilizer. I'm going to talk about training and pruning, especially blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries. And then I'm going to give you some recommendations for plant and cultivar selection. And at the end of this talk, I have some references, and Wing has told me that we can make the information, well, I'm going to make a PDF of this presentation, and it can be made available, so you'll have those references in a hard copy that you can download off a website where this video will be posted after the talk. And I also have some other references that I'm going to mention at the end that will be available, that will be useful for you, that will be also linked to this video that you can download after the talk. So with that, let's talk about site selection. I've listed on the left-hand side all the characteristics that ideally you would have when you were selecting the site to plant your berries in your yard. Now, you may not have all of these in your home garden. We all have some constraints with buildings and landscaping around, but try to get as many of these as possible to give your small fruits a good chance of getting established and doing well in your garden. So on the right-hand side is actually a picture of my one of my former community gardens before it was planted. And, you know, it looks kind of rough around the edges, but with a little work, it can be turned into something that looks pretty good with all those characteristics of being level, good sun exposure, well-drained soil. It doesn't have any low spots. You want to avoid low spots where water or cold air can accumulate if you can. You want to avoid conflicts, especially with trees and other landscape that might compete for nutrients and water and sunlight. And you also want to have a source of water nearby. And this site has all of those. So you can see what happens when you have all of those good characteristics in one location. You'll get a pretty good production from your garden. I want to talk a little bit about irrigation. You can irrigate by hand, or you can use a watering system. If you use a watering system, drip irrigation system, or some other type of irrigation system, you want to group your plants by water needs, so that if there are any plants that have the same requirements will get the same type of water, and those that have different requirements won't get overwatered or underwatered. Just some general rules here, but the biggest rule in all the irrigation is that you want to water infrequently but deeply. So you want to make sure, especially with the perennial plants like blueberries and raspberries, that you give them a thorough watering every time you water, and then don't water them again until the surface dries out or just begins to dry out, and then water them again thoroughly so that the root systems get established more deeply into the ground. So you want to do that thorough watering so that the roots don't just all accumulate near the surface, but you have some roots going more deeply that will sustain growth when the weather is drier. Also, I highly recommend using mulches and compost in your soil to help improve the water holding capacity of your soil. Mulch will keep the soil surface moist and will also keep it cooler, especially in the case of blueberries, which is important. And compost will actually improve the water holding capacity of your soil, especially if it's sandy. Some other things for wise water use, of course, you want to remove weeds to reduce competition and also nutrients for your plant, water and nutrients for your plant. Irrigate deeply, as I said. Avoid watering every day, especially if you have heavy clay soils. And again, like I said, water a few inches below the current root system. So water thoroughly each time you water to encourage deeper root growth. So now I want to turn my attention to the soil itself. Soil, of course, is the foundation of the plants, and you really need to have a good soil conditions in order to get your plants established and have them grow well. And one of the things I want to talk about is soil pH. In the Pacific Northwest, our soils are mildly acidic. And for those of you who may not recall the soil pH or the pH scale, pH is an indication of how acidic or how basic or alkaline a soil is. A neutral soil would have a pH of 7. A more acidic soil has a lower number from 0 to 7, and a basic soil or an alkaline soil would have a higher number, 7 or above. So most of our fruits and berries and a lot of our vegetable crops that we grow really well between a pH of about 6 and 7. Strawberries grow best at 6 to 7. Blackberries and raspberries will tolerate or will do okay with a little more acidic conditions up to 7 neutrality. And blueberries like to grow best at a pH of 4.5 to 5.5. So you can see that we're a little low with regard to the pH for strawberries and blackberries and raspberries, and a little high here in the Pacific Northwest for blueberries and for their soil requirements. Now, all these plants will do okay in the native soils, but to optimize production and to really make them grow the best that they can, you want to adjust the pH a little bit. And how do you do that? Well, the first thing is you need to know what the pH of the soil is. And you can do that one of two ways. You can do a lab test. And I've included some lab test results sheet here on the left-hand side that you can look at. And lab tests are really great because they're accurate. They'll tell you exactly what the pH, and in this particular lab test, if you look in the middle right-hand side, if I get my cursor to move and you can see it, there's a little box here that says the pH of the soil in my backyard where I sampled it was 5.8. And this was before I did any treatment, and that's about what one would expect here in the Pacific Northwest. In addition to providing the results, a lab test, if you request it, will provide you recommendations of how to amend the soil to adjust the pH. It will tell you how much lime or how much sulfur to add to either lower the pH or raise the pH. The cost is about $15 if you do a pH test and a test for macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and for organic matter. But it takes 2 weeks, and it takes about 2 weeks to get the results back. You can also do a home test for pH, for example. It's a lower accuracy because you're trying to distinguish a color change. You put your soil and some reagent together and mix it with water, and it will give you a color change in the liquid that will range, as you see on the left-hand side in the photo, it will range from orange, which is about a pH, I think, of 4.5, up to a dark green, which is a pH of 7.5. And you have to compare the color that you see with that color scale to determine a pH. And it goes in about a half pH increments to make that decision. But you can use that information. You won't get any recommendations from the laboratory, but I can give you some rules of thumb for that, for adjusting the pH with lime or with sulfur to raise the pH a half percentage point or lower it a half percentage point. So there are ways you can do it, but you won't get an exact number. These kits are cheaper on a cost per test. It's $10 for 10 tests, so it's about $1 a test. And then you can get immediate results. You can know exactly right away what the pH is, or what the general range of the pH is. I want to talk about adjusting the pH of your soil. Once you know whether you need to raise it or lower it, you can use lime to neutralize soil acidity or to raise the pH. Lime also provides some calcium and magnesium. Lime, agricultural lime, which is a type of lime that you would use on your garden, is largely calcium carbonate. It may contain some other calcium compounds or magnesium carbonates. And they might all contain some other compounds as well, but the bulk of it is probably those compounds. There's the magnesium containing compound is called dolomitic lime. The calcium containing product is called calcitic lime. Lime is great because it also promotes root growth and it creates an excellent environment for soil organization. It also improves the soil structure, which is how the little soil particles, pieces aggregate together in the soil once you apply it. So it helps improve the soil structure by aggregating small soil particles so you get larger pore spaces for air and water in your soil. So it's great for that as well. On the other hand, if you need to lower the pH of your soil, make it more acidic in the case of blueberries, the sulfur is added. The primary reason for doing that is it improves the availability of some nutrients for the acid-loving plants. And in both cases, you can just scatter this compound wearing gloves on your garden, as I'm doing here in my community garden. This is the soil acidifier that I used. What I was showing there was the lime. And this is how it looks when you apply the sulfur-containing product. They also often have sort of a yellow color. This is sulfur that was applied around the base of a blueberry bush at the Oregon Food Bank a few years ago when we were doing some work on pruning and fertilizing and adjusting the soil pH around the blueberry plants. So how much lime should you add? Well, if you get a lab result back, like I've shown here on the left-hand side, and it says the pH was 5.8, they'll give you the top part. There's a lot of information here, but the top part of this is all the analytical results for nutrients, because I asked for more than just pH on this analysis. It's all the nutrients that were there and whether they were high or low. And then the bottom part of it is actually recommendations from the laboratory. And what they're telling me in this lab report is that I need to add 140 pounds of 100 score lime to my garden to raise the pH from 5.8 to the level of about 6.5. And I asked for them to give me the recommendation in pounds per 1,000 square feet when I sent in this the sample for laboratory analysis. So let's just step through the calculations. They're telling me I need 140 pounds of 100 score lime. And I went to the nursery store to buy some lime product. I found this particular product and it says it has a lime score of 90. So how do we work that into the calculation? Well, what that means is this particular product is just 90% as effective as a 100 score lime. So I'm going to have to add a little bit more of this product than if I was adding a product that had a 100 score lime rating on it. And it's not any better or any worse, it's just a little bit different, and you just need to take that into consideration when you add the product to the garden. So I need 140 pounds of lime, 100 score lime. So I'm going to adjust that 140 pounds by dividing by 0.9 because I'm going to add a little bit more to reach that same quantity or that same value. And so I'm going to have to add 156 pounds of this product to 1,000 square feet, but my garden is only 200 square feet. So to raise the pH of that 200 square foot garden, I'm going to need 32 pounds per 200 square feet. And let me just look up, because there is a recommendation for if you just do it by hand with your home kit. I want to read that to you. If you're trying to raise the pH of your garden, say you did a home test kit and you found that your pH was about 6 and you wanted to get it up to 6.5, you can add 10 pounds of 100 score lime per 100 square feet of your garden. So 10 pounds of 100 score lime per 100 square feet will raise the pH of your garden about a half a pH unit. So if your home pH test is reading 6, you could add that much to raise it to about 6.5. And I would recommend doing that in the fall or early spring, and then letting it sit a year and then testing it again and see how that did. So that's the rule of thumb you can kind of use if you're using a home test kit. And that recommendation came from some OSU publications. I'm going to switch gears here now a little bit to fertilizer. The other important thing, of course, is to know the amount of fertilizer to put on your plants. A few things you need to know is the source of fertilizer, the amount to put on, and when to put it on. And it's best to add it based on test results, especially the first year. It's done a little bit differently especially for blueberries and raspberries in the second, third, and fourth years and subsequently, and I'll talk about that a little later. But again, we're looking at a lab result that gives us a recommendation of adding, in this case, 2.9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet of garden. So that's something you could do, and you could go through the similar calculations that we did with the lime for nitrogen. It's the most important nutrient for most home gardens. And most berries, we're talking about the source now, most berries take up nitrogen in the nitrate form. And so almost any well-balanced inorganic fertilizer that you find at the garden store or nursery will work. 16-16-16 is a very common fertilizer that you'll find. It contains 16% nitrogen, and you can see it's ammoniacal nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen and urea nitrogen. So various sources of nitrogen, as well as phosphorus and potash. Here's another one, same thing. It contains a slightly different mix of nitrogen, but it also contains urea nitrogen. And with plants that require to take up nitrogen as nitrate, any form of nitrogen will be fine because the reduced ammoniacal and the urea nitrogen get converted fairly readily to nitrate in the soil and are readily taken up. So any of these fertilizers work well for strawberries and raspberries. Blueberries are a little bit different because they take up nitrogen only in what's called the ammonium form of nitrogen, the reduced form of nitrogen. So for blueberries, you want to buy a source of nitrogen that contains ammonium compounds like ammonium sulfate. Organic fertilizers will also work very well for this purpose. So this particular fertilizer is one that I use because it contains mostly nitrogen. It contains a little bit of potassium. You can see this 2603, which indicates the amount of percentage of nitrogen is 26%, phosphorus is 0%, and potassium is 3%. So you can, this is a great fertilizer if you just need to add nitrogen. It's for lawns, but of course you can use it for whatever, as long as you just need nitrogen. Another good source of nitrogen, a slow release source, of course, is compost. Adding a ½ inch or an inch of compost every couple of years will slowly add nitrogen to your berry plants. Feather meal is an organic source. It's a little bit lower percentage nitrogen, only 12% nitrogen, so you have to add more of it. It tends to be a little more expensive. It is OMRI certified, Organic Materials Research Institute certified for organic farming use. The best time to do that, of course, is before you plant. If you haven't planted your berry bushes or your strawberry plants yet, get that soil amended before you plant. And then you can yearly amend in the spring or just before bud break. And also, sometimes it's beneficial, especially for blueberries and raspberries, to split that fertilization and provide half of it before bud break, half of the recommendation before bud break, and half of it in early summer. Those recommendations, by the way, so the first year you may get a recommendation from a laboratory that says add 2.9 or 3 or whatever it is pounds per 1,000 square feet. Subsequent to planting, especially blueberries and raspberries, you'll apply the nitrogen based on a per plant basis. And you can find those recommendations in publications from Oregon State University. And I've just excerpted one here from Growing Blueberries in Your Home Garden. And their recommendation is to add 0.25 ounces of nitrogen per plant in the first year, 0.8 ounces in the third year, and 1 ounce in year 4, up to a maximum of 2.5 ounces per nitrogen per plant subsequently as the plants mature. And of course, you're increasing the amount of nitrogen every year because your plant is getting bigger. And I highly recommend that you consult one of these publications for the details of how much nitrogen product to add to your plants each year as they continue to grow. So just to help you through some of the calculations on a per plant basis, they said, of course, let's assume the recommendation is 1 ounce per plant of nitrogen. And going back to this product that we looked at earlier, which is 2603, it's only 26% nitrogen. So you're going to have to add more than 1 ounce of this product to get 1 ounce of nitrogen. And since it's only 26%, and let's say you have 5 plants that you want to fertilize. So how much nitrogen or how much of this product are you going to need to apply to get 1 ounce of nitrogen per plant? And the answer to that, like before, was that you divide the 1 ounce that you need by the percentage of nitrogen in the fertilizer, which is 26%. So you're going to have to add more of this compound, more of this formulation than the recommendation in order to get the amount of nitrogen that you want. So you're going to have to add 3.8 ounces of this product to get the 1 ounce of nitrogen. And if you've got 5 plants, you're going to need a total of about 19 ounces, or let's just round up to like 20 ounces for the 5 plants. So they're each getting about 4 ounces per plant. And you'd sprinkle that around in the drip line of the root zone of the plant at the beginning of the year, or you could split it into 2 applications, one just before bud break and one as the fruit starts to develop in the early summer, say in the middle of May, would be another good time to do that. Another thing that you want to do is you want to add organic matter and mulches. Ideally, it's just fine if you have a 3 to 5% organic matter in your soil. That's generally adequate. A lot of gardens have higher than that. People have been adding compost to them. It's okay if it's higher than that. You don't want to get it above 15 or 20% because you can get leaching of nutrients into surface water or groundwater. At some point, you can damage plant, although it takes a fairly high, very high quantity of organic matter to do that. But generally, if you have 3 to 5%, that's okay. Then maybe add a layer of organic matter, a layer of compost every year, 2 or 3 inches every year, and just let that decompose on the surface, and then the nutrients will filter down into the soil. Mulches are also great to use, especially around blueberry plants. They conserve water. They inhibit weeds. Blueberries benefit from a really thick layer, relatively thick layer of mulch around them. I use sawdust, just plain sawdust that I can get from one of the local soil suppliers. Keeps the roots cool and moist. Blueberries have some fairly shallow roots, and having a nice thick layer of mulch around them keeps those roots moist and keeps the plant healthy. So those are things you should consider doing if you're going to grow berries in your yard. I want to talk briefly about pruning. You want to use clean, sharp, and right tools. I have 3 types of tools laid out here in the photograph. The red-handled tool is a bypass shears, a hand shears, which can cut stems up to about a ½ inch. The hand lopping shears can cut things up to about 1 3/4 inches. And anything larger than that, you should use a pruning saw. You want to keep those tools clean. I use rubbing alcohol, isopropanol, to clean my tools in between jobs. If I'm just cutting in my yard, just cutting my blueberries, which are all right next to each other, I do all that, and then I clean my tool. If I'm going somewhere else, I'll clean my tool before I put it away and when I bring it back. So I'm always not taking disease organisms from one plant to the other. Also, keep your tools sharp. This is a little sharpening tool that you can get at the hardware store, and you run it along the edge of your pruning shear to keep that 15-degree angle and keep that blade sharp so you get nice clean cuts. You want to do that periodically. And there's some videos online. I don't have one myself to show you today, but there are videos online that show you how to do that. Most pruning is done, a lot of pruning is done, especially on blueberries, in particular in the winter, raspberries as well. This is an example of a blueberry plant being pruned in the winter. You can also prune, raspberries get pruned in the summer. You'll be removing old flora canes that have been growing for 2 years and have fruited. Those will be removed in the summer. And this is just an example of that. I have more information on that coming up, but this shows you summer pruning and what it looks like in raspberries. All the canes that were fruiting the previous year have now been removed from this row of raspberries. And so you just have canes that grew this year or for that growing season in this photograph. What to prune? The easiest thing is to start with dead, diseased, or damaged wood or other problematic. This is a blueberry branch that really doesn't have any fruiting wood on it. It's gray, which indicates it's fairly old. You can see red branches behind it, which are younger branches and will be more productive. This has no large buds on it. It's really hard to see buds on this particular branch. None of the buds on this branch are going to produce berries, so that's something that would get removed. The last piece there was how much to remove. That depends on the plant, and I'll talk a little bit about that in blueberries. I have a video coming up here where I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it just depends. That I highly suggest that you consult one of these publications that are free and online from OSU, Growing Blueberries in Your Home Yard and the companion Growing Raspberries in Your Home Garden. There are also two companion publications that list cultivars that you can grow for each of those crops. So I highly suggest going to this catalog, the Oregon Extension catalog, and checking out those publications to get more information on pruning and cultivars. So now I'm going to talk, the rest of the talk is going to be on specific crops. I'm going to start with blueberries. With blueberries, I've listed here some varieties, and I'll do this for all the crops, listing varieties and then planting and spacing. And I may go through all of this or just kind of loosely go through this, and you can read about it later. But one of the important concepts with blueberries is to choose several different varieties that produce fruit at different time. And I have them arranged here. I have like about 8 or 10 varieties that are arranged with the order of ripening. So the Duke and Early Blue produce fruit in maybe late May or early June, with Chandler and Elliott producing fruit in August. And so if you have varieties from the early season, mid-season, and late season, you can have blueberries the entire summer. So it's really important if you want to have blueberries throughout the summer to choose a number of different varieties that produce fruit at different times. You don't need to have more than one plant in general. If you just want to have one plant, that's okay, because they are self-fertile. But if you do have more than one plant and you have different varieties, you will get slightly larger fruit. Apparently, cross-pollination produces larger fruit. And there are publications, which I referenced earlier, that you can check out. They make lovely ornamentals, of course, when they're in bloom. Here's a half-high variety, which I mentioned in the text, that's growing near someone's back door. And half-high varieties are really nice for edible landscaping because they fit well into the landscape. This is a great location. It's near a friend of mine has this near their back door, and they can go out and pick blueberries. And they also have the lovely red foliage in the fall when the plant leaves start to turn color. The best time to plant blueberries is October, late in the fall or early in the spring. Now is a fine time. You'll find lots of them in nurseries right now. They can be spaced about 4 to 5 feet apart. And the hardest thing about planting blueberries is that it's really a good idea to remove the flowers the first year. I know it's hard to do, but you'll get a stronger plant, a better plant in future years, and it will get well established in the first year, putting its energy into shoots and roots rather than into fruit the first year. And then it'll pay off in dividends in subsequent years if you don't let it fruit the first year. So just after it blooms, just remove the flowers and berries so that they do not form the first year. Oh, and just a final shot. I mentioned the red foliage. This is a blueberry starting to turn red in the fall. So they do make a lovely addition to your landscape as well as to your garden for eating purposes. So I now want to walk through some pruning of blueberries. This is you're going to watch the evolution of this blueberry plant this is year 1, and I'm going to take you through year 3 to show you how it's evolved over time. This was a plant that was somewhat neglected in my backyard for a while, and you can see that it has a lot of sort of gray growth over here. These are older stems. The red stems are newer, younger growth, more vigorous growth, and the gray stems are older growth that's really not very productive. And now is a great time to prune out your blueberry plants, to go in and prune your blueberry plants to improve production and down the road. So this is that plant the first year before I pruned it, and this is what it looked like after I pruned it. You can see all that sort of gray wood has been mostly removed. There's still some gray stems, older stems here, but most of the wood now is this sort of reddish wood with fairly large buds. You can see up here at the ends of the branches, some nice large buds. Those are the flower buds. So that's what you want to have. And that's how much I removed, which in this case was pretty close to about 20%. I had 15 branches I counted before I pruned. I removed 3 of those, which was 20%. Plus I removed all the growth that was on the right-hand side. So about 20%. Most subsequent years I have removed less than that because it's now starting to be better trained. But that's about the maximum you should remove in any given year. A cultural tip is to add sawdust. I think I mentioned that early. Do it every couple of years. It keeps the roots cool and moist and improves the health of the plant. And one of the questions that people always say, well, if I cut things down to the ground, won't I just kill the plant? Well, no, because what will happen is the plant will put out new shoots from the base, which will replace the old branch or old cane that you cut out. So here's that, or a neighboring, this is not the same plant, this is a neighboring plant that I'd cut back all the way to the ground. And you can see that this piece that I'd cut down really close to the ground has already, this is probably in late May or early June, is starting to put out shoots that will renew more productive canes, both from the base of this stump that's here and also kind of from these other cuts that I've made on other canes around. So in a few years, those canes, you'll lose, of course, the cane that you cut back, which may not have been very productive anyway, but in a few years, these will turn into much more productive canes than the one that you took out. So yes, the plant will grow back, it will recover. So go ahead and go in there and cut that out, old growth out. So now I want to walk you through the whole pruning process in this video that I made that shows that plant in year 2 and how I pruned it in year 2 after it had grown a season from what you saw in the previous slides. So I'm going to run this video and you can see how to prune a blueberry plant.
This blueberry plant that I'm going to prune today is about 5 or 6 years old, but was neglected for several years. And last year was the first year that I gave it a good pruning, and I removed about 20% of the growth on it, old growth and low growth. And this year I'm going to remove another 20%, and I want to walk you through that today and show you what I'm going to do. But before I start, I want to show you a couple components of the plant so you understand some terminology. One thing I want to show you is that blueberry plants have 2 types of branching growth. One is whips, which are these straight stems that come out of the ground, and they eventually grow and develop and produce laterals, and the laterals are where the fruit is born on the plant. And I want to show you one of the fruit-bearing laterals. This one right here, you'll notice that the fruit buds are at the end. These big fat buds at the end of the stem. We're late in the dormancy season, so they've actually started to break dormancy a little bit, so you can see them very clearly. And further down the stem are vegetative buds which produce leaves. Both are important to the health of the plant, and I want to show you those today, a little bit about that. So with that, I also want to show you the tools that I use. So for large stems, I would use a lopper. If they're, say, over 1/2 inch or maybe up to 1 inch or so, I'd use a loppers. Or for smaller things, less than 1/2 inch, I just use a pruning shears. And today, all the wood that I'm going to cut off of this plant is fairly small, so I'm going to use a pruning shears. So the first thing I do is remove what we can call the low-hanging fruit, the things that clearly need to be removed. And those things include dead wood, small whips, and low branches. So let's take a look at that and remove some of those right now. So down here you can see this branch is dead, it's a dark brown. I'm going to remove that branch. And there's another one over here that I'm going to remove, and a couple of small ones up here. So just go through and remove those things, and there aren't too many of them, so I'm going to move on and remove low branches. And the reason to remove low branches is it's hard to pick fruit when it's close to the ground. And it also, those branches get shaded by the taller branches and aren't as productive. So I'm going to come in here and remove these small branches that are growing close to the ground. There's that one. And that one. Oops. Tough to cut. There we go. And this one. And this one. And I think this one. And I think I'll remove this one. And the last thing, I want to remove our small whips. Now, when the plants regenerate after you've pruned them, they'll produce whips that grow up from the roots or from the bottom of the stems. And so I want to remove the weakest ones. And usually you remove ones that are smaller than the size of a pencil. So there aren't too many of them here on this plant, so there's just a couple to remove. I'm going to remove these two small ones down here, and this one actually got cut off earlier. So there we go. So now I'm going to make some major cuts here to kind of open the plant up. And I'm going to do that. There's some older growth on here that's not as productive as some of the younger growth. The berries are produced on 1-year-old wood. So I'm going to get rid of some of these older pieces of wood that also are denser in the center of the plant. And so I kind of want to open up the plant a little bit to let more light in. So I'm going to make a couple cuts. I want to show you this branch right here. This stem, I'm going to take this stem out. You can see that there's not much productive wood, and the tips of the branch are kind of dying back anyway. So I'm going to come all the way to the bottom, making sure I have the right branch. And I'm going to cut that off close to the ground, like so. And one thing by pruning, it's going to stimulate the growth of the plant. So later this year, there will probably be a whip that forms at the base of that cut. And finally, there's one other sort of unproductive piece of wood in here that I want to cut out. And it's an older piece of wood, and eventually maybe in a year or two, I'll probably take out the whole piece. But right now there's a fairly productive branch here, but there's some other branches that aren't as productive, and I'm just going to cut it right here. And that, by doing that, it really opens up the plant. And so I probably cut my 20% at this point. There were 6 or 7 main branches, and I've cut off one complete branch, and I've cut off probably half of another one, plus a lot of small wood. And I've actually put it over here on a tarp so you can see how much was cut off. And that's probably about 20% of the plant if you look back over here at the plant as it's now pruned. So with that, your plant is ready for the growing season, and you're ready to harvest blueberries later in the year.
And to complete the story on this particular plant, I've included a picture from year 3, which is this year. And I did only really minor pruning on it, so I'm not going to show you what I pruned this year, but it was really minor, just a few small branches that needed to be cut off. But if you look on the left-hand side is year 1 unpruned. In the middle is year 1 pruned. The video showed the pruning in year 2. And then on the right-hand side is a photograph I took actually just yesterday to demonstrate this. It's year 3 pruned. You can see now that there's a lot more of the red stems, a lot more productive wood. It's a little difficult to see with the scale of the slide, but there are a lot more flowering buds on this plant. There are a lot of more of the fatter buds that will produce flowers and then fruit. The other thing that it's a little hard to tell from the photograph because they are slightly different scales, but the plant is now taller. It's a good 10 inches to a foot taller. If you count the boards on the fence behind it, it was about 9 boards high before, and now it's about 11 or 11 and a half boards high. So it's about a foot taller than it used to be. So the fruit is more accessible. It's more productive. A lot of good things have happened with some careful pruning. And if you follow those steps, you can improve the production of your blueberries or keep the production strong in your blueberries as well. I'm going to move on now to strawberries. I've got listed different types of strawberries here on the left-hand side. There are June bearers, there are ever bearers, there are day neutrals, and there are Alpen strawberries, which are the ones shown in the photograph, these little tiny strawberries, which are natives. And they're good. They don't produce a lot of berries. They're very flavorful. They're kind of fun to grow. They make a great ground cover. But for growing in your garden, if you want a really good crop of berries, traditionally people grew June bearers, which produce one really big crop in June or July. But for our climate and our area, I really like the day neutrals. I grow day neutrals in my garden, and they will crop almost continuously from late May until frost, as long as the temperature is less than 90 degrees. And even last summer, when we had that really hot weather, my berries continued to produce pretty well. And I had a pint of berries or more in the early part of the season, and then kind of trails off, but continuous production certainly through late September and into early October. I was getting about a pint of strawberries a day from a small plot in my backyard, which is maybe 2 feet by 6 feet, plus some plantings in my community garden, which is another maybe 2 feet by 8 feet. So those two plots produced about a pint of berries a week all summer long. So with the day neutrals. And the variety that I like to use is pictured here in the left-hand side, which is called Seascape. And it's a great little day neutral variety for our climate. There are other really good ones, TriStar and Albion. If you want to go with the June bear, so for example, if you want to put up a lot of jam or something and you want one really big crop, Hood or Schuchsen. I've grown Schuchsen. It's a really great variety, very prolific as well. You want to transplant the plants in the early spring. We mentioned the pH of the soil before. You want to keep it around neutrality and plant the plants about 12 to 15 inches apart. You will need to renew the beds every couple years, especially if you grow the June bears. They produce lots of runners, so you'll have to manage runners by clipping them off and preventing them from growing all over your garden. I'm not going to go into that, how to do that this year, but you might want to check out some of the publications that I recommend at the end of this talk about how to grow strawberries. I do want to say a little bit about planting strawberries. This is how you would get a strawberry plant from a nursery. It would come as bare root. I'm holding it here in my hand by what's called the crown. My index finger is resting on the crown, and you want to plant that right at the soil surface. So you want to make sure that that's not too deep or not too shallow. And I'm just going to demonstrate that here. I'm putting it into the ground, and you'll notice in this photo that I haven't quite covered it up with soil yet completely, but I've spread the roots out so they were in the hole, so they'll get well established and spread out in the soil. And then I'm going to cover that the roots up just up to the crown, so that crown is right at the soil surface. And then in about 3 or 4 months, you'll have a nice little strawberry plant producing strawberries. And some people say take the strawberries off the first year to get the plant established. I don't do that. It probably weakens the plant a little bit in the first year, but I let it produce some strawberries the first year because I just can't wait. Unlike blueberries, where it is important to, to not let them bloom the first year because you're trying to establish a plant for a long period of time. Strawberries, less important, but you can still get better production and better establishment if you remove some of the flowers or all of the flowers the first year. But I actually, myself, personally, don't do that. I want to now switch to finally the caneberries, raspberries, and blackberries, and also throw in a little terminology here. There are 2 growth habits to blackberries and raspberries. There are raspberries that produce on first-year growth, so they produce a crop of raspberries on the tips of canes that grew the first year. And then if you cut those canes off a little bit, and I'll show you how to do that, and save the bottom portion of the canes, those canes will also bear fruit at the beginning of the second growing season in June and July. There are other raspberries, and also almost all of the blackberries produce fruit only on second-year growth. So the first year they just grow vegetatively, they don't produce any flowers, And then the second year, those canes produce flowers and fruit, and then you remove those canes. So there's two growing habits, and you kind of need to be aware of that in terms of how you manage your raspberries and blackberries with regard to pruning. And I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides. So primo cane varieties are great because you can really extend the growing season. And if you produce, so you can have a crop the first fall, you cut the tops off, you let the bottoms go, you'll have a crop on those plants the second spring. So in June and July of the second year, you'll have a crop on the lower part of those plants. You can remove those canes after they've fruited. And while they've been fruiting, new primary canes, primo canes, will have been growing, and those will fruit again in the fall. So in the second year, you'll have both a spring crop, an early summer crop, and a fall crop. So we get almost continuous cropping during the growing season by managing the raspberries that way. And so some of the good primo cane varieties that you manage this way are things like Heritage and Carolyn are two red types. Fall Gold and Ann are two yellow types. I grow Ann. It's a really great variety. I really like it. It's a golden or a yellow raspberry, and it produces two crops, one in the fall and one in the spring. Some of the floricane types are one of the more traditional ones you see a lot in growers here in the Willamette Valley, Meeker, Cascade Delight. And those you manage, of course, they grow the first year, don't produce fruit. You leave them in the ground over the winter, and then they produce fruit the second year. And after they fruit the second year, you remove those canes, and new canes will have been growing up, which you then leave and will fruit the following year. So you'll have one crop from those in June or July, but only in the second year. So again, now is the time, like blueberries and strawberries, now is the time to plant those plants. They can be spaced about 2 feet apart in hills, and trellis is a good idea for, I use a trellis, I use a system for my raspberries. It's definitely needed for blackberries. I'm going to show you that in the next few slides. First, a little bit about planting. These are raspberry plants that I dug from my garden and are ready for transplant. Kept the roots moist for, I dug them out in February, I think. I kept the roots moist for a while because I was moving them to a new location that wasn't ready yet. Kept them moist by wrapping them in burlap and keeping them dark in my garage where it was cool, and then unwrapping them and planting them in March. If you get them from a nursery, they'll come like this, wrapped in plastic with some shredded newspaper around them. In any case, you want to plant them at about the depth that you dug them out of the ground. It's usually pretty easy to see. Raspberries are a little more forgiving than other plants like the strawberries because they will root adventitiously. They'll produce roots spontaneously if you plant them too deep, but do try to get them about at the same level they were planted before, which is where the arrow is pointing. You can usually tell that by where the roots are coming out and where the stem starts. Get that at ground level. And then in a few weeks to a few months, you'll have some raspberry plants coming up, and you'll have some production. If you have primo cane type plants, you will have production in the first fall. I want to go a little bit into pruning. This is an idealized diagram of how a raspberry plot could look, and you can use this 2-wire system. At the top, this is the one that I use, and I'll show you what it actually looks like in an application. But you have a post with a spreader that's about a cross arm that's about 18 inches wide, and you let the plants grow within that area, and then you tie them up to the wires. I do something similar, although I don't do the fancy tying that they show here with bundling the canes. I just use the wires to keep the raspberries within a certain growing area. And this is what my raspberry patch looks like at my community garden. This is before pruning. This was actually just this past week, and I haven't pruned it yet. I'm actually going to do that tomorrow. But when I go in there and prune it, these are the primo canes. These are the canes that grew up from last year, and they fruited at the ends, the tips of these shoots fruited last year. And next week, I'm going to go in and cut those tips off and remove weak growth to get them ready for this growing season. But you can see that there's a steel post on either end of this with an 18-inch crossbar, and then there's some wire running across here. And I keep my canes constrained into that area to keep them out of the path in the community garden, but also to make it easier to access and to harvest the fruit by using that system. works really well. And just to show you what I am going to do next week, I'm going to go in at the bottom of the plants and cut out any weak growth. So any of the shoots that are really less than the size of my little finger, or really big fat pencil, I would take out. They're not very productive. They're usually shorter than the larger canes. You can see all these larger canes that I've got here in the garden, and I've marked with yellow. Those little yellow bands are the weaker canes that I'm going to cut out. They're short, they're smaller diameter. So when I'm done, it looks like this at the bottom. So I've only left my more robust canes that are all about the same height. They're all at least 4 or 5 feet tall. And I've cut out anything that's weaker or shorter. And where I've cut things out, new shoots will grow in the spring, and that's where we'll have the primo canes that grow this year. At the tops of the plants, I cut off any of the dead wood at the top down to the first living bud where fruit and flowers were last year. So you can see I'm pointing to where there was fruit last year, and that's all turning dead and brown. And when I'm done, I'm left with, you can see the circled area down below. I've cut off about maybe a foot of each of those. And the canes that are left are about 4 feet tall. And you can see inside the circle there, if you look closely, there's an active bud in that, at that branch point, so that side bud will come out and will produce flowers and produce my summer crop this year. So basically what I do is I go in, I cut out anything that's outside the area where I want my raspberries to grow, so they're being supported. I cut out any weak canes, and then I cut off the tops of the canes so that I don't have that dead material at the top, and I can get easy access to the fruit that's going to be produced this spring. And then this summer, I'll harvest that fruit in June and July, cut those canes back to the ground, and the new primo canes will have come up in that time, and they will again produce fruit in the fall, and then we'll just repeat that process on into the future of pruning and harvesting. I want to finally wrap up with talking a little bit about blackberries. I'm primarily going to talk about trailing blackberries. There are also semi-erect and erect blackberries, but most blackberries that we have are the trailing blackberries. They fruit only on second-year wood, on the floricanes. So that is, they grow the first year, they just produce a vegetative growth, a cane, and then the second year, they produce flowers on those canes, and then those canes die back. You remove those, and then we established the canes, the vegetative canes for the next growing season. So some varieties for that, the trailing varieties are ones you commonly hear of. Boysenberry, Marionberry, Olalaberry, Loganberry are all trailing berries, great varieties. Triple Crown is a semi-erect variety. They're very sort of tribal names that are erect and sometimes thornless varieties, like Navajo is a thornless variety. Again, they're self-fertile, so one plant will fertilize itself. You don't need to have more than one plant. And you can check out OSU publication 1303 and EC 1617 for more information about varieties and how to manage them. Again, they can be planted in early spring. They do need support. It is important to support blackberries. They get very tall. This is an idealized diagram of what it would look like. I use this system in my garden. The posts are a little taller for blackberries than they were for raspberries. Raspberries, I use 6-foot metal posts. I use 8-foot metal posts for blackberries, so that when they're driven in the ground, the top of the post is about 7 feet above the ground, because the blackberries get much taller. You then put 2 wires between the posts and wrap the blackberry canes around those 2 wires to support them, and then those canes will produce side shoots, which will flower and produce berries the following year. So this is what it looks like in a commercial operation, very dense growth. This is what it looks like in my community garden. This is a fairly young plant, and you can see it's grown up the metal pole, and then I've wrapped it over and around that those 2 wires to support it. And there's no pruning that you do in the winter time for blackberries. You don't want to prune them in the winter time. The only pruning that you do is once the floricanes have bloomed and fruited in the second year, you remove those. And while those are fruiting, growing and fruiting, flowering and fruiting, the primo canes will be growing along the ground. And once you cut out the floral canes, you come back in probably late July or early August and take those canes that have been growing along the ground and start to train them up to the wires that you have to support the blackberries. So this year, this particular plant will flower on the wood that's up on the trellis, and at the same time, we'll be producing shoots that are running along the ground that will be the fruiting wood for next year. So that's how you manage the blackberries. Again, do not prune them during the winter time, but only prune them in the summer to remove the floricanes that have already fruited and are starting to die. So I hope this has been a helpful talk on growing the most common small fruits that we have here in Oregon in our home gardens: blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. Talked a little bit about site selection. Choosing the best site is important. At least try to get as many of those good site selection criteria as possible. Water your plants thoroughly so that the water permeates well down into the soil, so it encourages the roots to grow deeply. Use mulches to conserve water, weed to conserve water and reduce competition for our nutrients. You might want to amend the soil for fertilizer and for pH to optimize production. I've shown you a few information about cultivars and for pruning, but if you want more information, you can, there are some online resources. OSU has some online modules, which are really very detailed, much more detailed than I went in today. There's a cost associated with them, but you can take these online, and there's videos that show you how to prune blueberries, grapes, raspberries, and blackberries. They're self-paced courses. If you want to just read some additional information, you can go to some of these references that are provided at the end of this talk: Growing Blackberries, Blueberries, and Raspberries in Your Home Garden, various publications. There's also Growing Berries on the Oregon Coast, gooseberries, currants, and other minor berries, which is a little different than our climate zone, but a lot of the general information is applicable to us here in the Willamette Valley. Growing Strawberries in Your Home Garden is also another great publication for learning more about the different types of strawberries and how to grow them in your home garden. Finally, I am an OSU Master Gardener volunteer in the metro area, and this is how you can get in touch with us here in the Portland area: metromastergardeners.org on the web, at The Real Dirt on Twitter, or follow us on Facebook, which I believe some of you are doing today, watching this via Facebook at Metro Master Gardeners. I will now take some questions from you, and I will leave you, if we have time, Wing, we can do that. And Wing, I just want to leave people with this slide that is the website, and if you have questions that we don't get answered today, you can go to the www.metromastergardeners.org and use the web form on that site to submit a question to a Master Gardener, and they will get back to you. So thank you very much for your attention, and Wing, we can go to questions.
Thank you, Dennis. That was incredible. We have so many questions in the chat, Dennis, and some of them are were sent to everyone, and some of them were just to you and I. I know that toggle switch for chat is a little confusing, but maybe you just want to go through. I have time to hang out, and you know, if you want to go through and answer questions, I think that would be great.
Let me see.
And we do have one question in the actual question and answer Q&A box. So maybe I'll read that one out to you and we can start with that.
Yeah, I just opened that one.
Cool. Well, so we'll just kick off with this one. I've heard that compost is too salty for blueberries. Should I avoid adding compost to blueberries?
I have not had that issue with blueberries, and there are of course different sources of compost. I use the compost that comes from the city's Sunderland yard, which is basically leaf compost that they get from streets. But there are commercial sources of compost and other sources of compost too. I have not had any issues with just that type of compost. Sometimes there are composts which are composted manures, And you do have to be careful with those and make sure that the source is, get it from a reputable source, that it is well composted, because some manures can be higher in salts, and which can damage your plants. So a well composted leaf mulch or organic compost should be fine, or something that comes from a commercial source should be fine. I would, however, just be a little bit hesitant to use somebody's compost that they said, oh, this is composted manure that I got from, the horse barns or the cattle barns or from the chicken coop or whatever, and without knowing exactly how it was handled, because those can, in fact, sometimes contain salts that can damage not just blueberries, but any plants, because they're, especially bird manures, can be too hot, what we call too hot. So that would be my answer. Let's see what else we got.
Dennis, I'll just let you scroll through the chat and take it from here. I don't need to be reading out the questions. I'm going to drop some links. I already dropped some links for the recording, and then I'll drop some links for emailing Fix-A-Fair. Also, if you have questions or comments as well. But yeah, take it away, Dennis.
Okay, let's see. Someone asked, does wood ash provide the same sweetening as lime? And the answer to that is no. I believe wood ash tends to be a good source of I think it's potassium. I have to look that up for sure. But it's not going to add the same thing as lime. You're going to, in order to change the pH, you're going to need something like calcium carbonate, or something that's a combination of calcium carbonate and other things, maybe has some calcium oxides in it too. You don't want to have too much, because that can be too hot. But wood ash does not, in fact, provide the same pH adjustment as lime would. So that's good. Let's see. Yes. See what else is here. I'm not seeing too many questions.
We do have another one in the question and answer.
Yes, I see one. This is actually a very good question. I like this one. So should you be pruning your blueberry plant the year you plant it? So there's really not too much to do the first year. The only thing I do the first year that I plant the blueberry is, if there's anything that's like dead wood or damaged wood, if you bought the plant and there's a little, I would prune that off. The only pruning I usually do the first year on a blueberry plant is, as I mentioned in the talk, is to remove the flowers. Remove the flowers. Well, you can leave the flowers if you want, but certainly remove after the flower. Remove it before the flower stalk or the flowering before it produces fruit. So you don't want it to produce fruit the first year, because you really want the plant to put all its energy into roots, getting those roots down into the ground and producing new shoots for subsequent years. So it's really hard to do that. And people are like, oh, I just want a few plants, but it'll pay dividends in subsequent years. So that's really the only pruning I do the first year, because usually the plants you buy in nurseries are not that big anyway. So the only pruning I would recommend in the first year is to just cut off anything that's dead or hopefully not diseased if you bought it from nursery, and then remove the flowers. So how do you apply fertilizer when there's a 6-inch layer of mulch on blueberries? Well, you saw in the photograph that I took at the Oregon Food Bank of the blueberry plants, we actually pulled that mulch back a little bit around the base of the plant, back from the drip line of the plant, and then applied the sulfur. We were there amending the soil for the pH, so we were adding a little bit of sulfur to the soil. We sprinkled that around, and then we put the mulch back on top, and then we watered it well. So that's how we got around the layer of mulch. Of course, if you're watering through the mulch, eventually that fertilizer will get taken up. The issue, of course, is if you're applying nitrogen fertilizer on top of mulch, there's a lot of carbon in that mulch. And so the microorganisms that are breaking down the carbon in that mulch will soak up a lot of that nitrogen for their own use before it gets down to the plant. So you might want to, if you're going to apply nitrogen, pull that mulch back a little bit, apply your nitrogen, don't apply it all as a clump right around the base of the plant, but kind of spread it around the drip line of the plant or around the base of the plant, and then put the mulch back on top of it so that the fertilizer isn't percolating down through the wood mulch, which might have microorganisms growing in it, degrading that wood mulch, which would soak up all the nutrients. So that's what I would recommend. With that, let's go here. So someone, they say they got some raspberry starts some years ago, and they have no idea if they're primo cane or flora cane varieties. What do they do? Well, I would say if you cut them back at the beginning of the spring and they grow up and they produce fruit on the tips in the fall, you have primo cane varieties. If they grow up the first year from the ground and they don't produce fruit, then you have flora cane varieties. So you would prune them like a primo cane variety where you could have, and you can actually, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but you can actually manage the primo cane varieties in a couple different ways. I like to manage them where I allow the fall crop to produce, then I cut them back partly and have a spring crop followed by another fall crop. You can just manage them so you only have a fall crop. You can, and you actually get more berries that way in the fall. And to do that, you would just, they produce a crop in the fall, and then you come in March and you just cut them off at the ground again and they grow back up. And that way you would get yet another fall crop that year, and then you just keep cutting them off. You don't get a spring crop, but you get a fall crop. And some people do that, and they get they keep raspberries throughout the year because they grow both a primo cane crop, which they manage that way. So they cut it off every spring and it produces every fall. And they grow a flora cane variety in addition to that. And the flora cane variety they manage by letting it grow the first year, producing the second year, and then cutting all those flora canes out and then having it produce. So their flora cane variety is producing in the spring, and their primo cane variety is producing only in the fall. It's a little complicated to try to get all of that in a talk, but since you asked that question about managing primo cane and flora cane varieties, I thought I'd throw that in. So you can manage primo cane varieties in a couple different ways. Flora cane varieties only bloom on second year wood. So if you're not getting any flowers on the first year, then you've got a flora cane variety.
Dennis, did you see that new question in the Q&A?
New question in the Q&A. Let me just see here. Oh, so someone recommended, as there was a new question in the Q&A, it says, this person notes that OSU recommends you do not use regular compost because it is high pH and high salt. I'm not sure about regular compost, what that means, but do not use manures, as I talked about, and they agree with that. I'll have to look into that. I have used compost for years on my berries with no problem. I don't put a lot of compost on. Every couple years you put a little compost on. You don't necessarily need to do it every year, so it doesn't accumulate. The big issue with using compost regularly on any crop is you can get too much organic matter in your soil, in which I talked about earlier, where you can get leaching of nutrients into the soil or into the surface water and into the groundwater. Especially phosphorus can be kind of high and accumulate over time if you're adding 3 or 4 inches of compost every year. So I do not recommend adding that much compost every year, but again, I have personally used a little bit of compost every year and it seems to be fine. I think you would have to add a lot of compost to get more than 1 inch or 2 every year or every few years to get high salt accumulation, because any salts in it are going to leach out over time. Again, I'm not sure what it means by regular compost. I certainly mean like the regular, year after year use of a lot of compost would certainly cause those problems of high pH and high salt. And that's certainly something you want to avoid, as well as the manures. Oh, and someone noticed that when I made my cuts on my raspberries, it looks like it was a 90-degree cut. And if it did look like that, it could be that I didn't make that cut really well, but it should be, maybe it should be a little less than that. It should be like a 45-degree angle or so, just slightly above the bud, ideally. You don't always make those cuts perfectly, but that's what you should try to strive for. So you are correct, it should not be a 90-degree angle cut, but on small branches like that, and especially on raspberries, it doesn't make as much difference as it does like on a fruit tree, where you're making a cut that might, you want to heal over and last for several years. This cut needs to last for part of a growing season, and then you're going to take that cane out anyway. It's not like you're trying to establish a scaffold system on a fruit tree. So it's somewhat less important, but yes, you are correct that the angle should be at something less than 90 degrees and as close to the bud, but not damage the bud as you can get it. The question is, so Marionberry is treated like a blackberry and pruned the second year, and I believe that is correct. I believe the Marionberry is a trailing berry. Let me just confirm that. I think I had that in my list of trailing blackberries. Yes, the Marionberry is a trailing blackberry, and so it is treated, it is pruned in the second year. So it will grow a vegetative cane, or canes actually. In the first year, those will fruit and flower, or flower and fruit in the second year, and then you will cut those back and establish the canes that have been growing along the ground as your new floral canes for the next growing season. All right. Going to see if there are any more questions, some thank yous. I think that's it. The guides, you posted the guides. I don't see any more questions. Yes, someone wrote, and I agree with this, there is no regular compost, and each compost is different, and it's true. That's why I said it's important to know the source of your compost, whether it's a manure compost or whether it's a leaf compost. Leaf composts are going to be lower in, or get nutrients and organic matter and stuff. They're not going to be as hot. When the organic compost from manures and things are going to have more issues with the salts, I think. It does depend on your source, and again, if you're making home compost, it's different than if you bought it commercially. The biggest issue with homemade compost is it doesn't get hot enough. People don't let it get up to 140 to 160 degrees or so that it needs to get up to kill soil-borne pathogens. Whereas commercial compost has generally been treated that way if you've gotten it from a reputable source that actually selling compost and not just from a horse barn or a cow barn or something where they say they've done that. But you know that it's been treated so that it has killed soil-borne pathogens that might be transferred from year to year. And that tends to be the biggest issue that people have when they use home compost, is it doesn't get hot enough to kill pathogens and they spread disease from one year to next. So just a word of caution about compost. I don't see any more questions, Wing. If not, we can wrap this up. I think, Wing, you're still on mute. Oh, and again, I see that Marcia McIntyre, who's online and is an OSU Master Gardener Extension person, and she's noted that if you have questions, again, you can go visit www.metromastergardeners.org. if you have questions, and submit a form online and ask additional questions. I just got, sorry everyone, I just got a text message from Wing, and he's having some technical issues, and he's trying to work through those. If you go back, I see there's a question about where they can see the recording. Wing told me earlier before we started that he will be posting this online sometime probably in the next week or so. If you go to the Fix It Fair site, I'm sure you can find the link to that. In addition, there will be a way to get access to some of the documents that I've referenced. The references will be listed, as well as a PDF of this presentation itself. So I'm going to end the webinar. Wing seems to be having some issues. And oh, Marcia just posted on the chat the location for the recording. So if you have a question about that, you can check that particular link. So I'm going to sign off and have a good day, and I hope you learned some things today, and we'll have some, apply some of those techniques in your garden and have a productive small fruit season in your garden. Thank you very much.